Boa tarde a todos. É um prazer ter o público aqui presente, um prazer enorme ter o Juan Garcia como convidado. Eu vou passar a palavra para o Javier, que vai contar um pouquinho da biografia do Juan. Obrigado, Juan, por ter vindo. Espero que todos gostem do seminário. Boa tarde.
Boa tarde, Dani, muito obrigado. Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos. Para a gente é um louvor, né? Estamos muito agradecidos por Juan Garcia por estar hoje conosco no seminário, que está sendo gravado também. O Juan, ele já vai apresentar, né? Ele vai apresentar seu artigo sobre violência e imigração na Colômbia, mas são duas frases, né? Um pouquinho do histórico do Juan. O Juan atualmente é do doutorado da Universidade de Bocconi, no norte da Itália, e é professor adjunto na Universidade de La Sabana, em Colômbia, né? Juan é colombiano. Juan tem um mestrado em administração pública pela Universidade College London e um mestrado em desenvolvimento econômico pela Universidade de Almeria, né? E um BA em economia também na Universidade Nacional de Colômbia. E como vocês vão perceber, as pesquisas dele trabalham a questão de desenvolvimento econômico, avaliação de políticas, educação, mudança tecnológica, né? Juan também trabalhou na gestão pública, né, no Ministério que no Brasil chamaríamos de moradia e cidades, né, na Colômbia, tá? E numa organização, um think tank colombiano que chama FED Desarrollo, né, FED Desenvolvimento. Então, sem mais prólogos, passo a palavra para Juan. A ideia é que Juan possa apresentar com calma, mas no máximo 30 minutos, para depois ter um pequeno debate e também abrir para perguntas para quem estiver online no YouTube. Obrigado, Juan, mais uma vez. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you, Daniel. Again, boa tarde a todas y todos, and thank you for having me. It is actually my second time presenting at UFF. I did it like 4 years ago with some other researchers, so I think that this is a great opportunity. Please, just if you have like any question during the presentation, just interrupt me, and I'm more than happy to respond on a ongoing basis. You can also ask questions in Portuguese, in Spanish. I think that there is a chat open so that we can also interact. Without further ado, I'm gonna start with this presentation, and in this paper I wonder whether political violence in Colombia has any impact on academic outcomes, and in particular in academic migration. So what I'm trying to look is whether actually like some people who is exposed to violence, they are more or less likely to migrate, and what are the reasons behind these people to migrate to other parts of Colombia. So just a brief introduction of the armed conflict in Colombia. So the armed conflict in Colombia was one of the long-lasting like conflicts all over the world, more than 60 years, over 9 million of conflicts, and that include armed clashes, interpersonal mines, forced displacement, many different types of events, many different types of people who were affected during these 60 years of conflict in Colombia. And just to make so this number in relative terms, it is like 9 million of people affected by war, but we are more or less a population of 50 million of people. So basically we know each other, each one of the Colombian people knows one familiar, one relative, one friend who has been affected directly or indirectly by war. So this is super important in our country. Please, Daniel, next one. So this is this paper in a nutshell. I wonder whether this exposure to violence foster or not academic migration, and I try to test heterogeneity, so what are the most affected or the less affected populations, as well as some mechanisms to try to explain why are the reason why people wants to foster and migrate to other parts of Colombia. Two key definitions before I start. First of all, I mean by internal academic migration, the declaration of people to go to study to other department, which is different to the one that they are living during high school. So that means like more or less the state level in Brazil, which is the second administrative level in your country. And basically, I'm looking for people, for example, who were born in Rio and want to migrate to study, for example, in Sao Paulo, in Minas Gerais, in Amazonia, or in other states. So this is internal and academic migration. This is a movement across the second administrative unit from Colombia, which is actually departments, similar to what we understand here as a state. And the other key important definition is exposure to violence. So I'm gonna measure exposure to violence at the municipal level. So in Colombia, there are more than 1,000 municipalities, and in each one of these municipalities, I get information on how often are the forced displacement, the armed clashes, different violent events, and with this information, I try to disentangle how is the exposure of this violence at the municipal level. In terms of the data, I use administrative data from more than 340,000 senior high school students in Colombia, which actually they are in the last year before they graduate from high school, and then they potentially they want to go to university or to pursue technical and technological university, what we call in English vocational training. And they actually, when they were presenting a specific exam, which is a national standardized exam similar to the one of the SAT in the US, which basically defines the scores to enter to some specific university, they were asked about their preferences to study. So in terms of these preferences, I got information of these more than 340,000 students about what they want to study, where they want to study, what are the reasons they want to study in higher education. And this information ranges from 2009 to 2014, and this is actually representative of the whole high school population of Colombia, which with the expansion factor, we are talking of more than 3.4 million of senior high school students in Colombia between 2009 and 2014. What I do is that these are like students at the high school level, then I follow them up and I see whether they actually graduated or not. I see their academic performance during higher education and from which field and where do they actually graduated. In terms of the methods, I use an instrumental variable approach. And to deal better with endogeneity, I use a shift share, or what is called in the literature as the Bartik approach. And the results so far, in a nutshell, is that the exposure to violence decreases the intention to pursue higher education. So actually, those who are more exposed to violence, they are less likely to, in terms of the preferences, to declare like the intentions to go to higher education, to go to university, in particular to college education. But also at the same time, this exposure to violence increases the intention that the student in once it is exposed to violence, he wants or she wants to migrate to other parts of Colombia to pursue academic careers or academic opportunities. So what this is to say basically that what seems to be is that this exposure to violence decreases overall the intention to study, but also increases the intention to go to other parts of Colombia in particular, which are less exposed to violence. In terms of the heterogeneity and the mechanisms, the most exposed or the more affected to this violence, and which also like decreases the intention to higher education, increases the intention for going to other parts of Colombia to study, are actually like males, minorities, in particular indigenous groups, and finally students from rural areas are the most affected by this phenomenon of the violence. Finally, what I find is that asking those students about the reasons behind it, why they want to migrate to other parts, I find that it is much more important the demand mechanism. So they want to go there not because in their state there is no a university which actually offers the program which is of their interest. They want to migrate because perhaps because they declare that there is better institutions there are better institutions there, because of the academic and professional further opportunities after they graduate from those specific programs. Daniel, please. Can we go? So I'm gonna pass this one like super briefly, but this is the literature, what we know so far about the literature on migration and academic expectations. But basically the decision whether to stay or flee from a violent area is shaped by different types of variables, including the harm of the physical violence, also like economic factors like employment opportunities, academic opportunities, physical infrastructure. So for example, connections between the town of origin and the town of destination, and different a wide of social aspects, which include, for example, institutional factors, social network, etc., and so on. And based on this framework is that I use and I try to merge this literature on migration with the literature on conflict. And what we know so far about conflict literature is that actually this conflict lowers academic performance, lowers attendance and attainment. So in Colombia in particular, we have shown that there are results that this conflict actually have positive, like lowers the effects of welfare and education in migration. In particular, it harms academic performance and educational attainment. And the reasons why we see like lower academic performance and lower academic attainment in some specific areas or students more affected by violence is because there is like uh, there is a so there is problems with the cognitive underdevelopment. There is more stress, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and this is actually what drives the results and what explains why there are like negative contributions for the conflict to um, academic outcomes. So what we have here is that this paper has three main contributions. First of all, it is the first paper which directly links the conflict literature, how these political conflict variables affect migration from an academic point of view. Normally, what we see is that these results are based on those who stay actually in those areas which are exposed to violence. But given the particularity of my data, I can follow these people and I can see whether they actually graduated or not from other places, whether they actually move or not. Second, this is a novel administrative data set, and this is a particular novel in terms of because they ask the students the preferences, and I can not only see the preferences, but I can also see the gaps or the differences between the preferences. So, for example, that one student declared to go to other department or to other state to study, and I can see whether actually these students graduate or not from this specific department. So far we have a lot of information on that conflict lowers attainment, but we didn't know how, for example, conflict affects these preferences, and this is novel in this data. And finally, there are some specific contributions in terms of the policy implications for two main things. First of all, the heterogeneity, which helps which could help the educational policy to target some specific groups which are more or less affected by violence. And finally, I deep delve into the mechanisms between demand and supply in order to have like educational policies based on these two sides. So, in a nutshell, this is the armed conflict in Colombia, 60 years of conflict, about 9 million of of victims in Colombia. The FARC, which was the most widely known, biggest armed group, was born as a Marxist insurgency in 1964, after a period called La Violencia. Then the violencia intensifies, particularly in the 80s and the 90s. It widespread across even the main cities. This is the time of Pablo Escobar. This is the time of Hermanos Rodriguez Gacha, Hermanos Rodriguez. It was the time of Gacha. It was the time of many of these cartels, which also like allowed to widespread the violence from mostly rural areas into the most urban places in Colombia. Then during this process, during this time, many peace processes fail, and the last one president, which is actually a Nobel Prize winner, Juan Manuel Santos, started a successful peace process in 2011. In this process, finally, we reached agreement, which was signed in 2016. And basically, we have like the armed conflict, the armed group, the FARC. They give up from the arms, and basically the violence lowered a lot after 2016. Right now we have a much more peaceful country. We have some dissident groups, which are like groups which were not covered by the agreement, but you know what we have right now is a heterogeneity in terms of the municipal level and the different departments of the state, which were most or less affected by violence during this period. So what we can see, for example, in the right side of the screen, is that in the main cities, which are like in this middle area of Colombia, including Bogota, Medellin, Bucaramanga, Cali, is where we actually find the best academic performance. This is also the places which were less affected by violence during all these 60 years. And on the other side, the peripheral areas in Colombia, nearby to the Amazon, nearby to the Pacific coast in particular, where there are much more like violent areas because of the civil war, because of our conflict, we can see that actually the academic performance and in many other variables, there is like less education, less employment opportunities, less economic opportunities, and we have like significant regional differences, also or partially explained because of the war. So it is just to say that it has been a long conflict. We have been trying to do many things. Finally, we reached an agreement. Of course, there is no much conflict as it was in a time, but still there are like regional differences in terms of this exposure, and I'm gonna on terms of this exposure to violence, and I'm gonna use this heterogeneity in terms of exposure to violence to see whether actually it had any impact on the academic migration phenomenon in Colombia. So I'm gonna briefly explain the data to start with the methods and then pass to the results. So what do I use is information on, as I said, from 2009 to 2013 of more than 300,000 senior high school students from a mandatory school high school test, which is called Saber 11. In this Saber 11, each student, all the students, high school students in Colombia, has to take that test, and they actually a 10% random sample of these more than 300,000 declare preferences for higher education in terms of where they want to study, why, what are the reasons, what academic careers, etc. And then I follow up all these people during the following years until 2013, and from then, from these more than 300,000, more than 90,000 have graduated actually from higher education in different departments of Colombia in different areas of knowledge. Next one, please. So what we can see here is actually that I got information academic migration, I got information of preferences, of graduation, of gaps, which is the difference between graduation and preferences, and I have like different others like information on whether the student want to study or whether the student actually graduate or not, even of those who stay in areas affected or not by violence. And in this diagram in the right side of the screen, what we can see is that in terms of the preferences, more or less 60% of the people of the students, or more than 200,000 students, declare when they were finishing high school that they would like to study the university. And then when I follow up all these people and I will see whether they graduated or not, I realize that only about 30% of those have graduated. So what is happening? There is a big mismatch in terms of the preferences and in terms of the graduation. And this is why I'm gonna not only study what is the impact of violence on these preferences or on this graduation, but also study the impact of violence of these gaps, which is the differences between the preference, what the students want, and the graduation, which is the realization of this preference of the student. Please. So here we go. So this is the exposure to violence at the municipal level. So in the main specification, I have like different robustness tests, more than 12 measures of violence. But in the main specification, I use the exposure to force displacement at the municipal level. So more than about 8 million of people from all these 9 million of the affected by war people in Colombia were actually forced displacement. So just imagine that you are in a municipality near the Pacific coast in Colombia on the left side of our country, and there is a lot of exposure to violence. So there are a lot of events, etc., and a lot of families are actually forced, are displaced by force. So what I'm trying to capture here is that difference, and based on that difference, I see whether being exposed to this violence, to force displacement in the year before you have to go to university, whether this exposure to violence actually affect your next not only the preferences but also the graduation and the differences between the preferences and the graduation. And the final message from this slide is that actually we can see a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the municipal level, because in some areas we have like 400 each student who took the exit test is exposed to more than 100 displaced people per year, while in some specific areas there is no like displacement. So so in some for some specific students, actually, like, there is a high proportion, there is a high exposure of violence. I'm trying to exploit this variation. Please, Daniel. What I'm using, I'm gonna pass super quickly about this specification, but I'm using an instrumental variable approach, which is a shift share approach. What I'm using is using I'm instrumenting this exposure to violence to the displaced people with some historical variables from Colombia, which are my instrument, which is, for example, the municipalities which were affected by the period of La Violencia before the FARC was created, the land conflict before the civil conflict started, and many other historical variables that explain the likelihood that there is like historical exposure to violence at the municipal level. So this is gonna be my share, the proportion of the exposure at the municipal level from a historical point of view. And the shift, I'm gonna use the US military cooperation to Colombia to fight against the FARC. And I'm gonna use as well like military budget from Colombia and many other robustness checks. So basically what is this shift share approach is trying to capture and trying to deal with the endogeneity of this force displacement by using a vector of share, which is the exposure, the historical exposure to of violence at the municipal level, and then I use a shift, which is at the national level, and multiplying these two, which are like has to be like more exogenous than what force displacement is. I'm trying to deal with endogeneity. So this is more or less explaining this slide in simple ways. I know that I have like 5 minutes left, so I'm trying to go a bit more faster here. So this is what I was explaining. The historical share of the violence is la violencia, the land conflict, and the national trend is the Colombian military expanded, and I like this one like in many things. There are a lot of papers on how to apply IB shift share. So I mean, if you have any question, please just tell me at the final part of the presentation or before. You can always drop me, but this is getting more and more common in terms of how to in terms of identification strategies. Next, please. So this is how we have like the information of the historical violence, so when where the land conflict was, the populations more affected by the period known as la violencia, and this is historical exposure because it was actually before the conflict itself started. So it is actually capturing like many other things which we cannot capture because of endogeneity problems of directly measure force displacement at the municipal level. Next one, please. So finally, the results. What we have so far is that the exposure to violence it decreases the intentions or the preferences for students to go to higher education. So if I live in a town more exposed to violence, I'm more likely to have like lower probability to declare the intention to keep studying into higher education. But at the same time, given that I declare that, for example, I want to go to study, that I want to pursue higher education, I don't want to stay in the same state. I want to go to other parts of Colombia which are less exposed to violence, and in particular to the main areas of Colombia, to the main cities of Colombia, like Bogota, Medellin, and Cali. In terms of the heterogeneity, what I find is that the men are more affected by this violence. They have a lower intention to pursue higher education. They want to migrate more once they declare. And this is true because many of these people who is affected by violence, in particular, there is like I mean, there is some evidence that families try to affect more to males than women for later reasons that we can discuss. Of course, like people who live during high school in rural areas, which are more affected normally by violence, they are more negatively affected in terms of this outcomes and minorities in particular. And finally, demand mechanisms are more important than supply mechanism, and I'm gonna explain that in the final slide. So we can continue. These are the general results of the IED shift share. I don't wanna emphasize on many things here, but just in terms of these two variables, which are overall intention, which is the intention to pursue higher education, we see a negative sign, which is like a statistically significant, and basically like given that you are affected by violence, it decrease by 7 percentage points the likelihood that you want to study higher education. And given and if you are exposed to violence but you declare that you want to study higher education, you are more than 20 percentage points, 27 percentage points more likely to declare that you want to study, but not in your own state, but in other states. So again, violence decreases overall intention for students, preferences for students to go to higher education, but increases the preferences for going to other states to study. This is the results in terms of the mechanisms for intentions, and what we can see is that the people who is exposed to violence, and actually those who are not exposed, are more driven by the fact that they think on demand mechanisms and not on supply mechanisms. Why is it important? Because there is always this question on the economic and the educational policies, whether we should have like more universities in all the states, or whether we should fund, for example, some specific students so that they can choose and pick up the best universities for them. And what we can see here is that actually people declare their intentions for academic migration and their intentions to study based more in on demand mechanisms. So people consider more the cost, the reputation of the institution, and further opportunities once they graduate. But they don't look, for example, if I live in a city which, even if there is a university and offers the program, perhaps I want to go to other place because there is less violent, but also because I'm gonna have like more economic opportunities. I'm gonna have like a university more renowned. So perhaps this is saying that people, and in particular students, are considering more the demand mechanism, and it should be important to have in mind in order to do the policy making and educational policies in Colombia. Um, so this is the conclusion. These are some conclusions. So in terms of the three main uh, contributions of this paper. So first of all, this paper lands the discussion on how conflict could affect academic migration in particular. This is novel in terms of this, and what I find so far is that violence decreases the preferences for going to higher education, but conditional on this. I want to study more in some areas which are not affected by violence. I use novel administrative data set, which for first time, to the best extent I know, we can have like preferences of a student at this large scale. So normally we see like realization, whether the student uh, graduate or no, many years after they enroll in college, but we actually didn't have information of preferences. So this data set is so powerful that we can even study many other things. And finally, in terms of policy implication, this paper suggests that in particular we should be careful with the people, or take attention to the people which are males, which are from minority groups, and which are from rural areas, that perhaps they are the more affected by the violence, and which could have like higher can be more affected in terms of the educational outcomes, but also the demand mechanisms drive much more than the supply mechanism, the educational policy. So it should say that we could consider this kind of constraints and information to do educational policy, and perhaps to foster more like demand policies than supply policies. Thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Javier, and thank you, everyone. Gracias todos y todas.
Muchas gracias, Juan. Muito obrigado. Dani, então façamos uma rodada de perguntas. Quem quiser fazer no chat no YouTube. Enquanto o pessoal vai escrevendo no YouTube, tem uma pergunta, Dani, tem algumas também.
Oi, Javier. Obrigada, Juan. Não sei se quiser começar, senão eu... Tanto faz.
Tá, não, começa você. Mas, Juan, si vos querés, lo que hacemos es recopilar varias preguntas y después te pasamos la pelota, ¿sí? Ahí
Perfecto.
empezamos Dani y yo, bárbaro. Empezamos
Perfecto.
Dani y yo mientras los estudiantes van, el público, estudiantes, profesores van escribiendo en el chat.
Muchas gracias.
Obrigado, Juan. First, I have a questions about, I don't know, how students enter in the university in Colombia. Here in Brazil, we have a centralized exam. How is this entrance exam in Colombia? And if people decide in the moment of the exam where he will go, and another thing about you talk a lot about the cost, the demand, and I was thinking about the supply, about professor, how the research decide which university we will give classes. Here in Brazil, we don't have this. I think we don't have this problem because we have this problem in, like here, we have this problem in not in higher education, but I think in fundamental education, like, because we have schools in favelas, you know, and it's too difficult for children to go to this school in certain times because there are a lot of violence and the school is closed. But sometimes they don't have the chance to choose to, how can I say, to escolher, how can I say escolher, to choose the school, because it's obligatory to go to the school near their house. In this kind of problem, they can't decide to migrate to another location, and how the police should think about this problem in this case, that it's an obligation to have the education near the house, and the house is located in a violence place.
Yes.
It's a little different. It's a different problem. In the supply side, we have that there are a lot of professors who don't like to go to these schools, these violence areas, to give class. So we have a lot of problems in the supply side, in the quality side. It's not the good one professor, probably the best ones who go to these places. I think it's only this for the moment. If I have another questions, I can put. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Juan, le agrego un par de perguntas, mientras la gente, as pessoas no chat podem escrever também, por favor. Então, bem específicas, continuando as dúvidas da Dani, pensando no Brasil, como que o acesso à universidade, se é pago ou não é pago, né? E se isso influencia ou não, né? Sistema falei em português, né? Se é pago ou não é pago, se é sistema de becas, como funciona isso.
Sí.
Después no sé si es una agenda de investigación, si la base lo permite,
Ujú,
será otra cuestión, es si la gente que consigue ir a estudiar a otro lugar, después cómo se relaciona, si vuelve o no, si mantiene lazos, ¿sí?
ujú,
Después si están pensando hipótesis para explicar la cuestión de género, digamos, afecta más a los hombres, pero que las mujeres ni intentan, históricamente no intentan ir a la enseñanza superior o intentan y la violencia no las afecta, digamos. Si podrías hablar un poquito más de eso. Y
sí,
después, no, un comentario más general. El otro día hablando con una profesora de sociología aquí en Brasil, que estuvo en
ujú,
Colombia,
sí,
le llamó la atención, y a ver si tú opinas lo mismo en el área de economía, cómo hay
ujú,
muchos estudios sobre la violencia, ¿no? Y un esfuerzo de visibilizar la violencia. Y en Brasil, bueno, está IPEA, está el Atlas de la Violencia, pero por otro lado la sociedad, como que para el que viene de afuera, Brasil no es violento, ¿no? Y en Colombia tal vez hay una mayor tradición, no solo de una formación violenta como gran parte de América Latina, pero
ujú,
también de estudios o cómo es eso.
sí.
Eh, eh, y aquí cierro, Juan, puede ser, con una pregunta que está en el chat.
Vale.
Eh, sobre este intento de buscar educación formal fuera de la violencia, ¿no?
Ujú,
Estas personas, o lo que ustedes estudian, es porque buscan educación fuera del país, fuera del municipio, fuera de la región. ¿Cómo es la escala de esa búsqueda fuera, ¿no?
listo.
La pregunta de Luis Carlos. Gracias, Luis Carlos.
Gracias, Luis Carlos. Listo, Luis Carlos, Javier y Daniel. Voy a responder y respondo en español. Voy a intentar hablar lento, que me entienden. De hecho, estoy aquí en Río y ya he estado un par de semanas en Unicamp y entiendo que ustedes nos entienden casi todo también cuando hablamos lento. Entonces voy a comenzar con las preguntas más fáciles y ya luego sigo con las un poco más grandes. La pregunta de Luis Carlos, la medición es al nivel estado, sería el nivel estado en Brasil. Entonces, por ejemplo, si alguien está afectado mucho por violencia en un estado, lo que pasa es que en Brasil los estados son grandes, en Colombia no son tan grandes, pero generalmente cuando uno tiene un municipio o una ciudad que es afectada por violencia, ese tipo de violencia, no solo está afectada la ciudad, sino todo alrededor los municipios. Entonces tiene lógica entender la violencia al nivel municipal, pero yo lo que estoy mirando es migración interna dentro de Colombia. Realmente la gente que sale a estudiar universidad fuera de Colombia en el pregrado, es muy poca, es menos del 0,01% de todos los que se gradúan del colegio. Entonces yo tengo información administrativa de todos los que se gradúan en el sistema colombiano después, pero lo que estoy midiendo es si alguien que, por ejemplo, está muy afectado en Río por violencia, quiere ir, por ejemplo, a un estado como lo de Sao Paulo, que de pronto hay menos niveles de violencia. Entonces, la medición de violencia y la migración es realmente a términos internos. ¿Listo? Es dentro de Colombia, pero entre las diferentes regiones de Colombia que tienen diferentes exposiciones en cuanto a la violencia. Y esto lo conecto con la pregunta que tú me hiciste, Javier, porque esto es interesante. Lo que nosotros queremos ver es una al final de cuentas, estos son diferencias en cuanto a la formación de capital humano de esas regiones. Nosotros vemos que hay muy pocos profesionales, que además de eso hay una dificultad en cuanto a la oferta de educación en esas zonas que son gran afectadas por violencia, porque por un lado los profesores e investigadores no quieren estar en esas universidades, por otro lado los estudiantes creen que no es una universidad tan buena y quieren irse a otros lados. Entonces ese círculo vicioso toca romperlo en algún momento si realmente queremos tener regiones desarrolladas en esos sitios donde hubo mucha afectación por violencia. Y esto es una de las razones también por las cuales es un paper con énfasis en migración interna, pero con una perspectiva regional que dentro de la versión working paper que estamos trabajando en Bocconi van a encontrar mucho más información al respecto, ¿vale? Entonces la idea eventualmente es ver desde un punto de vista de fuga de capital humano cómo esas personas se desplazan y lo que estamos viendo de momento es que muchos que esos que se van de las zonas afectadas por violencia no regresan a donde están afectados por violencia y se quedan en las grandes ciudades. Entonces es un problema de demanda, pero también de oferta y todo esto nos explica también las diferencias y por qué las grandes diferencias entre los diferentes niveles de desarrollo en Colombia. Y aquí respondo otra de las preguntas y es cómo es el sistema universitario. Nosotros por ley tenemos 32 departamentos y un distrito especial que es Bogotá. Todos esos departamentos tienen al menos una universidad, a excepción de uno que es Amazonas, que es cerca a Amazonas. No es Amazonas como tal, pero digamos que hay una densidad muy baja de personas, son comunidades indígenas, pero todos los departamentos tienen su universidad. ¿Qué es lo que pasa? El sistema colombiano está mucho más centralizado. Aquí hay una centralización seguramente en educación en calidad en Río de Janeiro, en Sao Paulo, en Minas, seguramente. En Colombia hay un setting similar, hay un contexto similar. La mayoría de personas quiere ir a Bogotá, a la Nacional, a los Andes, al Externado, a la Javeriana, o a Medellín, o a Cali. Pero además de eso, nuestra característica es un sistema mucho más privado. ¿Por qué? Porque las universidades públicas, sobre todo las de calidad, son muy estrictas en cuanto a admisión y muy pocas de las personas que se presenten llegan a ellos. Entonces las personas terminan estudiando en otras universidades que de pronto no son de mucha calidad o no son las públicas que querían. Entonces, entendiendo esto, ¿qué es lo que tenemos? Tenemos un sistema también que tiene mucha concentración en las ciudades principales, pero que además de eso es un poco más digamos que el sistema público es un poco menos fuerte que el que hay aquí en Brasil en términos de universidades, ¿vale? Entonces esas diferencias se notan mucho en Colombia y lo que nosotros estamos viendo cuando estudiamos las preferencias es que la mayoría o la gran mayoría de esas personas, cuando ellos tienen recursos, quieren ir a estudiar a universidades privadas o a veces a la nacional o un par públicas que son buenas. El resto de personas prácticamente declara que quiere ir a la nacional o a las universidades que son, digamos, las locales, pero las públicas. Pero gran parte de esas personas, más del 50% de las personas que dice cuando termina el colegio, yo quiero estudiar una carrera, realmente no la termina. ¿Sí? Que es un poco una historia triste y es mucho más probable que esas personas que declaren estudiar una carrera y no la terminen estén en áreas mucho más afectadas por la violencia. ¿Sí? Entonces aún tenemos un reto grandote en Colombia y no sabemos si es de oferta, demanda, cómo hacer, porque nosotros tenemos sistemas de becas, estamos intentando que lleguen más universidades, pero aún nos falta mucho para llegar a esas personas que están siendo afectadas. ¿Listo? Ahí yo respondí a varias, hay una que se me ocurre en este momento. Y es por qué los hombres son más afectados que las mujeres. Y esto es muy curioso porque en muchos otros settings, en los estudios de violencia, las mujeres son más afectadas que los hombres. Pero ¿qué es lo que pasa en este caso? Imaginémonos que esta violencia está mucho más en la zona rural, por ejemplo, donde se produce la coca, ¿sí? Eh, y donde hay conflictos armados. Y lo que pasa muchas veces a nivel familia es que las familias prefieren que el hombre sea el que se quede en el sitio, porque digamos que hay muchas labores relacionadas con la agricultura, incluso con la producción de estupefacientes, etcétera, que los puede hacer el hombre y que está menos. Entonces ellos intentan que más que las mujeres protegerlas y a ellas tienden a sacarlas más de esas áreas de violencia antes. Entonces hay una especie de priorización. Los hombres se ven más afectados porque el hombre, digamos que se puede defender donde hay violencia en términos económicos y es porque lo que buscan los grupos armados. La mujer intentan priorizarlo desde un punto de vista familiar y la sacan. Y esto no lo estoy diciendo yo desde mi investigación, lo están diciendo otras investigaciones en Colombia que ya se han dado en eso. Y finalmente, ¿por qué el estudio de la violencia es tan importante en Colombia? Sí, nosotros tenemos, eh, digamos que una tradición larga sobre eso, pero hay una combinación de dos cosas. Nosotros tenemos violencia política y violencia en las calles. Y aquí en Brasil también hay mucha investigación sobre violencia en las calles. ¿Sí? Pero en Colombia hay mucha investigación no solo sobre la violencia de las calles, sino la violencia que hubo en la zona rural por la producción de coca, por la producción de estupefacientes, por toda la cadena del narcotráfico, por la existencia de grupos armados y todo eso en el contexto de una guerra civil que duró más de 60 años, que hace 10 años, hace 8 años firmamos el acuerdo de paz y que aún estamos en proceso de construir un país en paz todos y todas los colombianos. Entonces, por eso es un tema mucho más saliente, digamos, yo creo que aquí en Colombia, pero también yo creo que hay muchas conclusiones que pueden aplicar incluso para un setting como Brasil o como otras economías donde hay conflicto civil o incluso conflicto, digamos, violencia de las calles, ¿vale? Como el arrestado o robos o bueno, otras cosas que nosotros conocemos bien el setting de ese tipo de violencia urbana. Esas serían mis respuestas. No sé si perdí algo, si se me olvidó responder algo.
Perfecto, Juan, buenísimo.
Ujú.
No sé si Dani tiene más alguna pregunta, si alguien más en el chat de YouTube tiene alguna pregunta.
No chat não tem nada.
Está. Entonces, Dani, si quieres hacer una pregunta más y le pasamos la palabra a Juan para que cierre
Se
de la mano.
nenhuma pergunta.
Bueno, yo le paso la palabra a Juan y después volvemos a Dani para que cuente cositas de la coordinación. Juan, muchísimas gracias por la explicación, tu tiempo y el detalle. Aprendimos muchísimo. Sí, de estas
Ujú,
cuestiones que son muy queridas aquí en el posgrado de educación, evaluación de políticas. Hay muchísimas investigaciones en el tema. Y además para conocer siempre un poco más de Colombia, donde ya han venido otros compatriotas tuyos, sí, y tener este vínculo también con la Bocconi.
ujú,
Vos mencionaste que está el working paper, así que después por mail nos pasás la dirección y lo ponemos, si te parece bien, lo ponemos en nuestro canal de YouTube como un comentario en el sitio. Sí, también si te parece algún email institucional
ujú.
para que los estudiantes y colegas que están online y que después lo van a ver grabado también puedan entrar en contacto. Y bueno, muchísimas gracias. Espero que tengas una buena estadía en Río. Pena que no pudimos hacerlo eh, en vivo por cuestiones logísticas. Sí, pero bueno, estamos cerca, el internet funcionó bien, qué raro. Así que
Sí,
bueno, te paso la palabra para que cierres y después sí cierra por completo, Dani. Gracias, Juan.
listo. No, gracias Javier, gracias Daniel, gracias a todos pues, los que estuvieron conectados, los que van a ver esto. Yo les envío la información pues con Javier, el contacto. Estamos trabajando en el working paper aún para que salga público, ya tenemos una versión de ello. También agradezco pues a todos los profesores, a Pamela Giustedini, a Massimo Manelli, a tantas personas en Bocconi, también mis compañeros, las personas con las que tengo afiliación en la Universidad de La Sabana. Y claro que sí, yo creo que estos espacios de discusión son importantes, muy feliz de participar y espero pues poder participar en alguna próxima ocasión y también estar aquí presencial para una próxima ocasión. Así que gracias. Les dejo mi correo, por favor, cualquier cosa que necesiten, que tengan inquietudes sobre esta investigación, sobre otras, incluso sobre Colombia o la Uniboconi con mucho gusto responderé, ¿vale? Entonces un abrazo y gracias a todos, gracias a ustedes por este espacio.
Obrigada, Juan. Tem uma coisa que eu lembrei, Javier. Tem muito estudante de Niterói, que vem para Niterói porque prefere Niterói porque o Rio é muito violento, né? Lembrei dessa.
Sí, sí,
Na
sí.
graduação, a gente é muito comum isso, né? As famílias do norte fluminense, os alunos da
Ujú.
graduação preferirem vir para a UF por conta do Rio ser uma cidade muito grande, muito violenta. Enfim.
Sí, sí.
Bom,
Sí, sí,
obrigada,
sí.
Juan. Acho que foi ótimo.
Ujú.
A Lisa falou, é o meu caso. A Lisa é de Minas, né, Lisa? Ela era de Minas e passou no mestrado, deve ter passado, não sei se, não lembro se passou no UFRJ, mas veio, escolheu a UF e acho que é um pouco isso, né?
Ok, sí, sí.
Bom, obrigado pela sua participação. A gente espera que, né, na próxima talvez seja presencial. Você volta para o Brasil ainda esse ano ou ano que vem?
Creo el año que vengo de pronto regreso al Unicamp. Entonces les escribiré, ¿vale?
Uhum. Aí a gente combina.
Ujú,
Bom, obrigado, Javier, obrigado, Juan, pelo ótimo seminário.
ujú.
Na próxima semana, eu confirmo, mas possivelmente a gente tem um seminário de uma convidada internacional também, que via Carmen, mas eu ainda vou confirmar isso direitinho com ela. Agradecer a todos presentes. Bom, boa tarde a todos e vou encerrar aqui a transmissão. Boa tarde.
Boa tarde.